Austin. I'm glad you
Thank
could
you.
make it. And
I
thanks
appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for taking my invitation.
Absolutely. One of the best cities in America.
Oh, there we go.
Second to Charleston, but
Yeah,
anyway.
So before we start, I just want to give everyone in the crowd a background on Mignon. She is former commissioner of the FCC. She served on the FCC commission from 2009 to 2018. She served as acting chairwoman in 2013. While at the FCC, Commissioner Clyburn was committed to closing the digital divide. She championed diversity in media ownership, initiated inmate calling service reforms, and fought to preserve a free and open internet. So very key issues, and key issues to the crowd here today. Prior to the FCC, Mignon spent 11 years as a member of the Public Service Commission of South Carolina. So she understands the regulatory environment that we deal with quite well. And prior to the PSC, Mignon was publisher and general manager of a family-owned newspaper, the Coastal Times. So, as you and I have discussed, the audience here is focused on communication technology issues, evaluation of the communication networks. We've been hit over the last couple days with 5G technology, cost, and other issues. And while these are critical, I think the one key issue that we really haven't dove into is the politics and the policy sitting behind all this and how they intertwine together. So I'm glad you came today so that we can kind of get into that.
Absolutely.
So let me ask you a couple initial questions, just a couple on your passions, just so that people understand where you fought at the FCC. And we can start with inmate calling.
Right.
Why is that an issue, and what did you push for?
Well, again, thank you for dragging me out of the cold and bringing me into the chilly. It is seriously great to be here and to have this conversation with you, Jim. When you talk about, in essence, what makes me tick and what my priorities have been, I guess if I had to kind of sum it up, when you talk about diversity and inclusion, inmate calling, providing more opportunities for smaller telephone providers, particularly the guys I call them in the square states. I'm not being offensive, but in the square states especially, where you've got a lot of independents that honestly didn't have the bandwidth or the capacity or sometimes the regulatory friendships to bring them to the next level, particularly the smaller wireless providers. All of those have a recurring theme with me, is how can government work better for those who need the most? How can it pay attention to those who have access to the least? And when it comes to that particular issue, inmate calling, it is one of those issues that is not sexy, that doesn't have a sympathetic or empathetic audience, and people have ignored it for years. It is a broken system. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you're among the very fortunate. But there are about 2 million persons who are serving time as we speak. There are about 2.7 million children who call them, mom, mostly dad, but mom. But because of an unjust and unreasonable and broken market structure, economic structure, they cannot afford to keep in touch. It is not uncommon for the cost per minute for a call to and from a facility, the cost to be in excess of $1 a minute. People who are mostly on the not so great side of the economic, because I don't like to call it sort of low wealth communities, because I don't believe in calling people poor. I just don't. But that might be income constrained. They're the ones most likely to have a loved one in prison. And they're the ones that are paying $300, $400, $500 a month to try to keep in touch, to make sure those children have better outcomes. So that issue had been punted for about 10 years at the FCC. It had been ignored too much at the state level. And I thought if I don't give it a voice and pay attention to it, then that problem would not be solved. That's significant to all of you because if that money is going to pay for those calls, that money can be invested in the communities. If inmates and families don't keep in touch on a regular basis, That means that a person, when they are released, and 700,000 inmates are released to society every year from various facilities, they go home as strangers, they're less likely to adjust, and within 5 years, 75% of them are back in. That's a high economic burden on us, and it is an economic burden on those families, causing them to not be able to invest, to adopt broadband, to do a number of things that they're foregoing, take their meds in order to keep in touch. It is important. It is one of those quiet, excuse me for saying this, evil systems that's really causing all of us to pay high costs, whether you see it or not.
Great. Let me jump to another issue, and again, it's you fight for the people that don't have a great voice in government, and one of the next ones is Lifeline. How can you explain Lifeline and just kind of what your thoughts and concerns were with Lifeline?
Lifeline is a 30-plus-year-old universal service program. Right now, they might have tinkered with it a bit, but when I was there, it's about a $2 billion per year program that seeks to bridge the economic gap for those in our communities that literally cannot afford a dial tone. We expanded it a couple of years. It's kind of limping along with this to include broadband, but it's a $9.25 per month subsidy that goes to the provider to enable either sometimes free or low-cost communication services for those who are most in need. So that program was instituted because, as with any utility, it is believed that the more of us that are on board, the greater economic benefits for the entire community. Because when is the last time you walked around and you saw a coin or a payphone? I don't know how. When I got to the FCC, I think there were 800,000 of them. When I left the FCC, there were under 200,000. And I guarantee you that number is way less. I hate to say it, I stopped paying attention because it was just not part of the ecosystem. So for those who are low wealth, how do they call 911? How do they keep in touch with with teachers? How do they find a job? How do they find opportunities? How are they connected? So Lifeline is an important tool for those who are making critical decisions whether they're going to eat on a given day or keep a dial tone. Believe it or not, there are millions of people in this country who make that choice every day. And I say this and people roll their eyes. Even with all of that, there are still 5 million people right now without any type of telephone service. And even with that subsidy, the barriers are high for 5 million people. That is not an insignificant number to me, nor should it be to you, because that means that they are among the really incredibly vulnerable, and not all of them are living in igloos and whatever. I love Alaskans most days. But, most people don't want to be off the grid. There are a lot of people who are, can't help but be off the grid. And if you look at, and I'm over answering, and I'm sorry, and just interrupt, because I'm a PK, I'm a politician's kid, so we keep going on and on and on. But this is serious to me because if you were to look at where the numbers are the highest, I call it sort of the Amtrak corridor. Baltimore City, Baltimore County, Newark, very economically challenged areas where people might pretend that they have a phone or that phone is on. But you'll be surprised how often there's a disconnect or they're not, they don't have service. Right. So that's why it's important. It's important for all of us, for people to be able to keep in touch.
So for the audience, how has Lifeline changed since you left and with the new administration and Commissioner Pai's, I'll say, regime in the FCC? See,
now he's starting to, anyway, I'll just say this. The current majority, we see the world differently. Right. We see our priorities differently. There were, at a pivotal point in, I think it was 2017, beginning to 18, there were 9 providers that were offering different types of services, catering to school kids, to those that might have wanted some kind of medical, assistance, just different types of providers that the then chairman stopped them, even though they went through all of the paperwork, they were on the cusp of being approved. He basically reversed course on that. And what that did was not allow for that program to be more innovative, inclusive, and opportunistic for those. Because that program, to me, is just not about a dial tone. That program, for me, let me back up. When you look at some of the average Lifeline customer, it is a grandmother, my age, taking care of at least one child. She makes about $12,000 a year, if she's lucky. This is her only means of communication, that phone. And she is only allotted about 250 minutes and 250 texts. Now, if you need to call your doctor, if you need to get some kind of service, if you get put on hold, that 250 can easily get eaten up, within days, you're talking about a whole month. And so to provide opportunities that have different types of frameworks that might have more minutes or more partners that will not have counted against a minute, if there were, a medical provider that said, these texts won't count against your text, that would have allowed for that program to be more things for more people. And I will admit that was, in terms of the leadership in me, that was a big, very sensitive point for us, because I thought the program could morph into something that would be competitive, vibrant, and I don't see that happening at this juncture.
Gotcha. So let me jump from some of those issues into kind of what we've talked about the last 2 days here, which is 5G.
Yes.
So as you think about 5G, where do you think the FCC is right now, and based upon your knowledge on spectrum allocation and how we can address some of the issues of getting spectrum out to the providers in the room to provide that service?
Well, I will say that when it comes to 5G and the focus, if there's one place that there is robust activity, is there. You probably know that the chairman announced what they called a fast 5G plan. And the objectives are pretty simple, but are complex in the delivery. And I want to be precise and give him credit where credit is due. He said the number one priority is getting more spectrum to market. Number two, in enumeration order, not necessarily in priority, is to revamp the infrastructure policies, at the FCC. And a complementary and third objective is to institute, the needed regulatory updates. And how the FCC is doing that, it is auctioning spectrum. It is bringing spectrum to market. It's working with NTIA to encourage spectrum sharing and the like that will fuel all of this. And so they're looking at it in a three-tiered way. They're looking at high-band spectrum, which is particularly applicable here. And I promise not to get too wonky. And if you looked at the FCC website, they just announced the conclusion of auction 101 in the 24 and 28 gigahertz band. I'll try to make that the wonkiest today. But they call that millimeter wave, wave band. So that brought in addition to bringing in $702 million to the government, that particular band is attractive when it comes to 5G use because it allows for more capacity. It doesn't penetrate walls and buildings. It doesn't go far, but it allows for that again the intense. The propagation characteristics allow for the intense types of usage that 5G infrastructure, when we talk about autonomous cars and the rest, what they would need to fuel. They also are looking at mid-band spectrum, which it would have a little bit of characteristics here and a little bit of characteristics there. And so those auctions, the auctions, including 3.5, will allow for up to 884 megahertz of spectrum to be allocated for 5G. And the low band spectrum that would be for improved use in three bands, again, will allow for more opportunities there. And we can't ever forget unlicensed, especially with the 6 gigahertz, band, that all of that will allow for complementary opportunities at lower cost. That baby monitor and that, I live in a condo, so I don't have this, but that garage, that's unlicensed. And all of that is helping to fuel, what is needed to keep, us ahead in the 5G race. So I will say that allocation of spectrum, and we'll probably get into it, a bit more, but, some of the infrastructure positions that the FCC has taken that has not gone so well in some of the state and local communities, really looking at how we get 5G to market faster and stay ahead of when it comes to the international race. So the FCC is fixated on that. We were first, in the world to really dedicate, ourselves to, providing the spectral opportunities needed to fuel all of that. And so that is, one place where, where depending on where your money and your opportunities are, that bears watching.
Thank you. And you mentioned infrastructure, which was I want to dig a little deeper into that. And we heard it yesterday from some people in the audience and actually in the presentation, which was the FCC, I'll put on my Muni hat, usurping my ability to charge just and viable rents for the space for the 5G providers to put their equipment out. So from the Muni, I say, man, these telco companies don't like rate regulation, they didn't like net neutrality, but sure in heck, they like to tell me how to price my stuff for them. They may not, people here may not like that, but.
You showed absolutely no bias there,
Yeah.
but I will say that this is the one, that particular order, I was not in sync with the majority. I felt that it was the wrong move. Some of the right reasons. Look, we all know that there are municipalities and areas in this country where there's a very strong NIMBY orientation. We know that. And so some type of backstop, I think, is necessary to kind of encourage these areas to act in as expeditious a manner as possible when it comes to siting, when it comes to particularly small cells and the things that we would needed for 5G enhancements. But this particular decision that was made, was very specific in terms of the localities would say there was a preemption. As you mentioned, it placed a ban or a limit on the fees that state and localities, can charge for processing applications when it comes to, this infrastructure and these intent and managing deployment of the right-of-ways. Is instituted shot clocks, which some cases are good, but you have to think about each municipality and if they're resource constrained. If you've got one person, like I talked to someone in Montgomery County, if you got one person and there are 200 applications a month for small cells coming in, and that person is not 100% allocated to do that. And think about the other municipalities that might be outside of those main hubs. There's a chance you're going to be resource constrained, but you've got 60 days to process an application or to approve an application if it's an existing structure. You got 90 days to approve if it's a new bill, and you have 150 days to approve if it's a non-wireless facility application. And if you fail to act, there are very significant consequences. All of this has meant, according to estimates, over $2 billion, $2.5 billion that will not flow to those communities. A lot of the negotiations that the companies and the municipalities had, they ceased after this order was released. Now, in terms of where things are built and the speed in which it's built, again, some people needed to be checked and balanced. Let me say that. But instead of having a more surgical, streamlined approach, if I could borrow from what this is said it's designed to do. It took a sledgehammer to a problem that I think that we could have addressed where the bad actors were, the insincere actors. But now everybody that good must suffer with the bad. I don't know if you had a teacher like that. I had a 5th grade teacher like that. 3 or 4 of us acted up. The whole class got punished. That's what is happening here, and I think it's unfortunate. Of course, it's going to be challenged, and I think it would lessen the goodwill and the cooperation of those municipalities. 75% of those city fathers and mothers in these facilities say broadband, this type of infrastructure is either their first priority or in the top 5.
Right.
So no one, I haven't heard anyone say I don't want these opportunities in my town. I don't want more ubiquitous broadband, faster speeds, gigabit speeds. I haven't heard anybody say not in my town. I really haven't. If you have, we can talk about that in a few minutes. But the priority is there. But what I have found when you talk about building partnerships and relationships in communities, particularly when it comes to siting, when I'm from Charleston, South Carolina, aesthetics mean a lot. I'm sorry, we just don't want an ugly small cell, on our monuments. And I'm being a little, I'm going a little further there, but there are a lot of people, there are a lot of mayors from very conservative jurisdictions who are very upset that it's going to not only chill the type of relationships that were built, that the aesthetics and the amount they had to pay to do other things that would have been complementary, all of those things would be at risk. $2.5 billion or whatever the estimate is a lot of money not to be flowing to communities. And that money is going to come from somewhere else because the needs are there. And I think it's going to, in the long run, be painful for state and local communities in their budgets.
Thank you. So tied to that 5G, so as the small cells go out and the cities allow the small cell to be there, you and I have talked about the need for the wireline and wireless networks to play together.
Right.
So as we think about that wireline network, what has the FCC done to help make sure that we have a robust as possible network out there to support not only broadband potentially, but the 5G? I know you and I worked on the National Broadband Plan.
Right.
We worked on the Connect America Fund to get that funding out.
Right.
Maybe if you can touch on those a little bit, and maybe
Yes.
what else is being done to help expedite the deployment of potentially fiber out into parts of the country.
So about, I guess we're nearing 10 years, on the National Broadband Plan that was delivered to this nation, sanctioned by Congress to serve to me as a template. I called it when I got to the FCC, my manna from heaven, because it, in 9 chapters, subject to check, really outlined what it was hoped through a lot of front-end engagement. I mean, they went out of there with their team, went out of its way to be inclusive. I mean, asked for comments, just, so much so I was rereading some things, for here. One of the public interest community, the person said, stop asking, you're driving me crazy. It was that, it was meant to be that inclusive. But what it did was allow the FCC to follow a remarkable template that was reliant on a broadband-enabled infrastructure. It really hardwired us to not just allow the money from the Universal Service Fund, which is almost a $9 billion investment that you help contribute every time you pay your phone bill. That was, the biggest chunk of that fund was going to build up and expand voice service. Now we made it very clear that it has to be broadband-enabled services. It's got to support our next evolution when it comes to technology. And so what that did was keep us checked and balanced. Maybe that's my phrase. conjugated differently depending on how I say, for the day. Because it really outlined, it kept us, on course, it kept us focused. And it reminded us with each chapter why this was important. When it comes, to health, when it comes to education, civic engagement, and the like, why being connected to the internet, why broadband was so important. And that if it was easier and more efficient to build on existing infrastructure and expand out, because again, we had the foundation there. But this, particular plan, which Blair, I guess you would say the lead author, Levin, helped lead the team and craft it. He always says that this plan was a perpetual beta, which means this is a living and breathing document that was, while it was produced at a point in time, at a snapshot, in time, it was meant to fuel, what would come next. We wouldn't be talking about autonomous cars or the Internet of Things or the shared economy, your Lyft and your Uber and other and Airbnb, all of the things that many of us have taken advantage of. That would not have been possible but for the blueprint laid out in the broadband plan and our willingness to follow that course and really reform universal service, which has allowed for a more ubiquitous broadband deployment in this nation. So, and that in and of itself is a building, not only is that traditional wired network helped to build out when it comes to broadband, it is a complement when it comes to wireless, services. So it's not the three of you in the room that might follow rap, it's not an East Coast, West Coast type of, I'm sorry, I won't go there. It is not it's not an either or. They're complements to each other. Because when you talk about backhaul, when you talk about fiber, and even copper, all of those things are needed to have a wireless infrastructure in terms of that backhaul. So we, if I can pick a second word for the day, it's a conjunction. Everything that we're talking about here, if it is lifeline, inmate calling, wireless, wireline, broadband, it's and. Because everything is connected to the other. It's a building block or a complement to the other. And if you neglect, any one of them, the rest of the ecosystem is harmed. So we've got to have auctions. We've got to get spectrum to market in order to fuel. But spectrum is finite. It is limited. So it needs to be shared. It needs to be more efficient. We need to work with the engineers. You've got to have, you can't just build and assume people will come. You've got to have programs in place that will allow for affordability when it comes to adoption. Because if, I don't know where the numbers are, let's say 72 or 75% of us, have broadband at home. What about the other 25%? What happens to them when the schools close? What happens to them when the libraries close? What happens to their opportunities for learning and for staying connected, or for doing research, or for getting that next best job? So all of these things are intertwined, which makes all of this so important. You mentioned one thing that that you've been talking about. Valuation. And I had a sort of valuation. I am not going to try to dip my toes into your waters because I don't know, but I don't know it well. But the word valuation really stuck with me when I read about, again, what you were focusing on doing. And it made me think about our AWS, or Advanced Wireless Services, auction in 2015. Now that was remarkable in a number of ways. It brought in $41 billion, to our coffers. But what the economists said its impact on society was, was tenfold in terms of its return. I bring that up here to say this. When we talk about the importance of infrastructure and needing spectrum to fuel and to help build this infrastructure, the multiples are great when it comes to societal impact, when it comes to business, and other types of, societal benefits. They're tenfold, sometimes immeasurable when it comes to opportunities. So, all of this is important. And we got to, for me, why government is important here, along with, some of you who might be, who are in the private business industry, why government is important here is because we know that all of these benefits, if private industry were left to morph and evolve on its own without a check and balance, without requirements, or without the government saying everyone should benefit, then everybody will never benefit. Businesses themselves are not organically inclusive, but we would all benefit from being included. And so, that's why, I like to say "and" a lot. Deployment, and adoption. 5G, and inclusion. All of these things are important because 5G, if no check and balance, if there are no requirements or, dare I say, demands from state and local communities, 5G is going to go where 4G LTE went fastest. It's going to go to affluent communities. It's going to go to high density, high net worth cities. And rural communities and low net worth communities will never benefit from what we're all so excited about. So that's why it's important for us to be multifocal, I believe, in our thinking. And recognize that with a tweaking here and with a partnership here and with sharing here by way of spectrum, we can realize multiple benefits from the same infrastructure and oftentimes with the same effort.
Right. Yeah, in part, first I'm thinking of Schoolhouse Rock when you sent conjunction, so I'm thinking that song is in my head. Conjunction function.
What's your function?
Yeah, so I apologize for that. If it's in your head right now,
I know.
It will go away in a couple days.
Yeah.
So
after a couple of visits to the bar, you'll be fine.
Yeah. Or you'll start singing it with your friends. So.
Yeah.
And for the younger people in the crowd, you got to watch Schoolhouse Rock.
Please look it up if you don't know.
Yeah.
But one of the greatest educational tools ever. I promise you.
Exactly. I agree. But coming back to you hit on it somewhat, but I just want to focus on rural America. And I put up some slides in the last presentation about the fact that deployment for the carriers in the room is just uneconomic for them. They just can't make the money. But as I mentioned yesterday, you and I talked about it's a greater payback than just the carriers. There's reduced healthcare cost. There's other costs. Can you kind of go into the broader business case for you and why government is there? It's not necessarily an evil thing for government to step in. They serve a purpose, and the purpose is?
I really look at, and you would not believe if you travel internationally and speak to people about our universal service construct, that it is the envy of many in the world. It recognizes that there are needs that are not going to be realized in the traditional marketplace. It recognizes that investment in these communities, particularly with the carriers that serve smaller communities outside of the traditional city and town hubs, that there is not only a benefit to them, but a benefit to us. And the benefit to them is multifold. Number one, keeping in touch. I don't even have to make the case for that. But what keeping in touch does, affordably keeping in touch, which is why the Universal Service Fund is there to keep the prices down for those where the economy of scale is not going to realize, the ability for you to economically, if that complement were not there to layer on top, to subsidize, dare I say the word subsidize, that build, which will result in a subsidization of what you would pay if the market, if left alone, to the market, you're able to stay home in a rural community and invest and expand your own business. So the entrepreneurial side of the ledger is promoted. You're able to find that job or qualify for that job or do that job if you have a strong broadband network that requires a telepresence. Because there are too many very talented people in rural communities that cannot get jobs and opportunities where places and people that don't require them to come into the office because they don't have a strong broadband infrastructure. My goodness, it's obvious. I have on a semi-muumuu, tailored, but muumuu nonetheless. I like to eat. Where's most of our food grown? Is not in Harlem or in LA, in terms of widespread. It's grown in those rural communities. So the infrastructure is needed there for those tractors, in order to make sure you don't plow twice, and for those farmers who are dealing with livestock to make sure that all of the sorry for the vegetarians, all of the animals get fed. All of those things are important, and they not only help rural America survive and thrive. Urban America is dependent on those resources to get to us in an efficient manner and as the most affordable manner as possible. And if you live 100 miles away from a doctor, then being connected and allowing for telemedicine opportunities not only helps you in real time, it helps that clinician in terms of billings and other opportunities. So again, going back to those conjunctions, ensuring that the infrastructure is affordably provided to communities large and small, rich and not affluent, again, regardless of where you are, it is important and it is a co-benefit. It's symbiotic. It is very necessary for all of us to move to the next evolutionary level. You hear me fixated about all of these things where it might not sound sexy or might not make it above the fold, because I recognize that technology and being connected is the greatest equalizer of our time. A lot of other things that we experience and see and do and come across, they have high hurdles when it comes to being accessibility. If I've got a good or service, I can't I'm not able to afford oftentimes a brick and mortar, but an online presence would allow me to be in this marketplace of the world. And so when we talk about what it means and how important it is in terms of this infrastructure and the access and the adoption to be ubiquitous, it is critically important, not just for that person who doesn't have, but for those of us who do have and may be able to have more from that person who is trying to have, if that makes sense. And so, again, that's why this is so important that, that we have all of the above approach by way of technologies, by way of investment, by way of opportunities, because we all benefit in the end. Right. But we have to be intentional about where the investment and the opportunities flow. And that's not going to be easy. It is absolutely not going to be easy. It's not going to be natural for us to have conversations with people and entities that we don't come across, they're not our BFFs. But you're going to have the same persistent poverty persistent lack of opportunity issues, we're going to be here, in our rocking chairs, but still, pretending to know that we're with it in about 30 years and still having the same problems if we don't address them now in real time. And that's why, if passion comes across, that's what I'm passionate about. Because not only am I just one generation removed from the grandmother who did not have, for the grandmother who didn't have opportunities. Both of my parents, for first generation college graduates. This is very real for me. And when I go back to those 12 acres, that's very real for me. And those persons who chose not or didn't have the opportunity to leave, they should have the opportunity to thrive.
Right. So wrapped into that, just another sticky issue, just so we can hit some sticky issues.
Okay.
Municipal networks. So there are certain parts of the country, we talked about rural America, we've put subsidies out there to help push services out, but there are many communities that say, we want fiber.
Right.
And the carriers say, we just don't have the capital right now to get it out to you. So some are taking upon themselves to deploy their own fiber network, many open access. But there are many areas, and actually many states, that have outlawed municipal networks. And I know under Commissioner Wheeler, he put forward the opening of municipal networks, but that was overturned.
We lost that battle.
Do you have any thoughts on municipal networks and what the issues are?
I remember being in North Carolina at a CTOA meeting a few years ago when round one of the North Carolina law, that would have been more restrictive in line, and they would have been among the now 35 states that either have laws that prohibit or restrict the development of public-owned broadband networks. And one of the things that was a recurring refrain was the fact that these entities approached the internet service providers about serving. They, in some cases, begged the providers to serve, and either they were ignored or those who were more general person-like, said that, I don't have the, this is not in the short-term plan. So they took it upon themselves. About 108 communities, according to one report right now, offer fiber internet. 24 states have at least one fiber to the home network available. But in most places, including my home state of South Carolina, if you decide to build or design a network, that network would be considered a private entity or enterprise, and all of the hurdles or all of the all of the requirements that any other private enterprise has, including tax and including contributing to certain funds, that would be applicable to you. So in most cases where the municipalities might be cash-strapped anyway, they can't afford that, our hurdle. So yes, we fought a losing battle to allow those people who said that investment is not coming to my communities. It is like water was, clean, potable water was 30 or 40 years ago in my community. It is what electricity was 70 or 80 years ago in my community. It is putting almost a stop sign in front of me being able to attract people, to attract businesses, to move to my next level. Not having a strong, broadband enabled infrastructure, I can't grow. I can't thrive. I can't make my community smarter. And so, now, with that and with these hurdles, you are very much dependent on the predominant provider. And little known, painful fact, most of us in this room only have one high-speed internet service provider. And when I say high speed, I'm talking about 25.3, what the FCC defines as high speed. Oh, you can dial up all day long. But, in terms of, having that provider, you don't have a competitive landscape. About half of you, if you truly look, you don't have an option. And so when you not only don't have an option because there's only one, and if you don't have an opportunity because there's none, how is that city going to move to its next level? Or how is that municipality going to move to its next level? So that was a very, I guess we, in a way, my advisor said, we're going to lose this, and I just wouldn't hear it. But when we lost it, I was extremely sad because it meant that where it really counted for the city to move to its next, a town to move to its next evolutionary level, we have quashed that opportunity, and we have cost them, possibly another 10 years of their, a growth in planning development. And, I just, for the sake of protecting an incumbent, I just offended about 3 people I know, entities I know, that's problematic. Right. And so I think I just lost a job. But anyway, I just, but that is why, it was so important to me to have, to better level the playing field, because the playing field, even though that was an argument behind the laws, right. You got to have a field to be, to level it, and when you're still, kind of digging up, digging up, and trying to smooth over the dirt, and you haven't even gotten to that point, then, I don't know how a playing field ever gets level, for those who need it the most.
So I'll finish up just so the audience has some time to answer or ask some questions. It's probably the stickiest question and what people are very interested in, but maybe if we can just maybe a shortened answer so they have an opportunity.
I'm sorry, I don't do well with short answers. I'm sorry, I'll do better. I just gave up. Really.
Yeah, right. Net neutrality.
Oh, yeah. Uh-huh.
So we know net neutrality, was at one point under Commissioner Wheeler pushed out that, the internet should be free to all, that the carriers who own that pipe should not restrict anybody from doing it, and that was reversed.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on, maybe a quick couple thoughts on net neutrality?
So I could talk about what the standard talking points that you hear about, how I think we are more at risk in terms of the openness, transparency when it comes to the provider relationship and the like. But the one thing that is still, irks me about this reversal is that when it comes to universal service programs, when it comes to providing broadband through universal service programs, nobody's talking about how vulnerable we are right now with the repeal of Lifeline. The FCC said that to get money from the Connect America Fund, you have to construct broadband-enabled infrastructure. Now, without net neutrality protections or without the internet being classified as a Title II, that is vulnerable. And your companies, that are getting universal service money to build these networks, you are vulnerable. There's going to be someone in a not so distant future that will challenge the FCC's dispersing of this money for this broadband-enabled infrastructure. And if they win, then your very cost model, your that deployment of that $4 billion could be at risk. So everybody goes to where the where the sound bites are, and I do believe most of the sound bites. I really do. But our universal service construct, our Connect America service construct, is more vulnerable now because it is not a telecommunications service. And newsflash, in terms of what the FCC's ability to regulate, we regulate telecommunication services. So if it's not a telecommunication service, how do we regulate? And if we don't regulate, how do we lawfully sustainably distribute those monies. So I wanted to leave that with you. I'm not going to come with the classic talking points, and that's as quick as I can get. I'm sorry, that's as quick and brief as I know how to be.
Yeah, that's a deep thought. So now I'd like to open it up to the audience. I do request no questions about government shutdown and what insights she might have from her dad. None of that, but anything else is open game.
Commissioner, thanks for coming. We really appreciate your time and your energy.
Thank you, Ruben.
The question of the incarceration and the high prices that per minute that these families are forced to pay. I'm curious, given the recent a bipartisan move and the interest for criminal justice reform, do you see an opening there for the FCC to finally take action, or do you think it's much more of a separate issue?
That would, to me, because I was trying to read about the first step of this of the bill, which by everybody's account was a first step. The FCC, the leadership of the FCC feels that because the bulk of the issue and the bulk of the revenue and about 80% of those calls are made intrastate. They're intrastate calls. So the FCC feels that it only has jurisdiction when it comes to interstate calls. So when it comes to bulk of the problem, there is this regulatory disagreement, because I don't necessarily agree with them, that should be handled at the state level. The only way for that to change from where they sit is for Congress to tell it what to do. So if definitely there's going to be, I am confident, another bill introduced to address that. But as it stands now, the current leadership will not move because it does not feel it has the authority to handle intrastate or deal with intrastate reforms. And that's, that's the big, sticking point when it comes to that. I'm hopeful. I really am hopeful. It's a problem worth fixing. And one of the things that, full disclosure, and we have to go apparently. Full disclosure, I am a fellow, and part of my focus is attempting to make the business case for reforms for inmate service. Make the business case, the economic case.
I took from your comments that you weren't particularly...
Oh, Gary, I just saw where you worked.
Oh, you did, didn't you? I should have turned that over, shouldn't I?
Can I just say it came from a place of love?
You hurt me. I took from your comments that you weren't particularly fond of the FCC rules that were recently passed in September regarding placement of small cells and the kind of dictating to municipalities all these sets of rules. What would you have preferred to have seen in its place?
I would have preferred us to put in place some type of backstop mechanism that would have gently but very forcefully nudged or addressed those who are the problem. The jurisdictions that are stalling or that were extracting exorbitant rents, outside of some type of, a cap that they put in place, because it's what, $250? I can't remember what it is right now. So that's what I would have preferred, a more surgical, streamlined approach, addressing the harms and not making the assumption that everybody is the bad guy here. And so that was, my issue. Because most jurisdictions were acting in good, faith. Numerically, most jurisdictions were acting in good faith. Might not have been what exactly you wanted it to pay, but it wasn't $3,000 or $4,000 where I have heard that.
Well, we just want what's fair.
I know you do.
Thank you. I appreciate your
No, I
comment.
appreciate it. Thank you. And, tell the guys back home I love them too. Yeah.
Coming from a rural area, why is the rural broadband not addressed in the same way the electricity was in the 30s, where there is a program to make sure that all rural areas are covered with some kind of a loan program versus the way it's being handled right now?
But there is, actually. Through, Russ, the rural, Yeah, I mean,
RUS.
RUS.
Yeah. So there is. The challenge is the amount of money and the amount of time for that money to be dispersed. So yes, in fact, you've got people who are a bit envious in urban areas who are saying we're paying too much attention to rule. So we make a $4 billion a year investment at the FCC. There are loan programs, low cost to almost zero, percent loan programs coming through the rural utility services. So that is happening. Some of my issue in terms of, and you're going to hear me talk about this in a few weeks, when it comes to what I think should be further universal service reforms, I really think we should be more targeted where that money is going. It is going to some places in some communities that are considered rural, but they got $2 million houses. They don't need broadband subsidies. They don't need subsidies, I'm sorry. Aspen, Colorado does not need a subsidy. Okay. I'm not going back. And if you live there, you know you don't need a subsidy. And so, so that is happening. It is not happening to the scale and scope and speed in which you, in which you might want. But it is happening. The infrastructure is in place. I promise you.
Okay.
And we can talk more offline. I'm not rushing out.
No, that's fine.
I'm Kimberly Hauser. I'm a professor at Oklahoma State.
Oh, okay.
And I did want to congratulate you on being appointed to the Commission on Artificial Intelligence.
Thank you.
I just had one question. In this committee, will you be considering privacy protection for data, or is it more a focus on national security issues?
So I will affirm to you that I have not attended meeting one, but I believe one reason why I was chosen is some of the perspectives that might not organically be addressed.
That was my suspicion.
Will be. So, so your suspicions are validated, and I assure you that they will be voiced.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.